This is Biomutant, a brand new IP. It is an open world action RPG that is made by Experiment 101 and published by THQ Nordic. You've most definitely heard a bit about this game by now, but I want to add my voice to the bunch. Just like as a TLDR at the beginning of this video, this is a game that in my opinion actually ends up being pretty good, but has a few problems that prevent it from being truly great in my view, and it's also a little bit too expensive. But it's absolutely worth playing if you can find it for the right price and if you're into more old school open worlds, but we'll get into all that in a few. So what exactly is Biomutant? It is a third-person action RPG inspired by a lot of other different games, which we'll also get onto, that is set in a world, sort of post-apocalyptic Earth, where humans are gone for one reason or another, and the entire planet is populated by mutant intelligent animals, which you play one of yourself. The character creation of this game is actually pretty neat because a lot of it has a big effect on your character's appearance, which means two individuals' characters are probably going to look quite different from each other, just statistically speaking, because there are so many different options. You can choose things like the actual fur pattern, as well as all the different colors that are on your fur, as well as determine your stats. And this is actually my favorite part of the character creation because the stats actually determine your appearance as well. So a very strong character will have a big upper body, a very fast character with a lot of dexterity will be really lithe and tall, and a very intelligent character will be more physically diminutive but have a larger head to incorporate that much larger brain that you got. So the character creation is actually pretty in-depth, which I like, and there's a lot you can do in it. And you also choose a class, and the class is actually pretty important. It doesn't only decide your starting stats, but it also determines what extra passive perks you can get later on from leveling up. So yes, this is of course an action RPG, so there is leveling, there's experience, there's loot, there's all the stuff that you would expect that moniker would come with. You have a full set of equipment as far as armor goes, so a head, shoulders, chest, and pants, no greaves or gloves, but you do have a back slot for a backpack, and I do like the fact that you have two separate slots for your shoulder pieces so you can mismatch them if you want to. You also have a melee weapon and a ranged weapon, as well as the fact that you can actually favorite like 8 or so of each of those so that you can switch between in combat very quickly if you want to, so you're not really limited to just one set of weapons, and in fact you have an entire set of outfits that you can use to save specific combinations of armor that you have equipped. That way you don't have to individually choose each armor piece every single time. This is important for things like the hazardous environmental suits you can get to be safe in certain areas of the map. That way you don't have to constantly go to your inventory screen and switch out every armor piece individually in a very painstaking and annoying fashion. You can just save each full set as its own outfit and simply switch outfits to the one that you need at the time, which is a nice touch. Whenever you get enough experience to level up, you will be able to put a point into any of your stats, which will increase that particular stat by 10, as well as you get these upgrade points that you can either use to purchase new combo attacks and special moves for the various ranged and melee weapons that you can get access to, or use them on passive perks that tend to be quite powerful, by the way. And you have two sort of trees of these passives. One is just a general one for your character that everyone will have, and the other is specific to the class that you chose. So for instance, since I chose Psy-Freak, because I wanted to focus on being like a caster character using the psionic and mutation abilities, that tends to focus, as you would expect, on your psi skills and things. So it's got stuff like key regeneration, just doing more damage with your psi skills, and being able to actually leech health when you do power damage to people and things of that nature. So there is quite a bit of character build customization, you could say, between all the different stat points you can use, all the various upgrades you can get, and all of the skills and weapons that you could equip yourself with at any given time. As far as these skills go, there are a couple of different varieties of them. There are mutations, which you get mutation points for to actually unlock, which you can get by defeating certain enemies or finding certain caches of them out in the world through exploration. And these are pretty cool, making a fist come up from the ground to bounce people into the air, throwing out bouncy mushrooms so that you can bounce, or you can also bounce enemies with that one if you want to, surrounding yourself in a mucus bubble that you can actually attach enemies to and fling them around with. There's quite a few different ones, and they're all pretty fun to use, actually. I personally really enjoy the fire trail one because it acts as both a dodge and an attack at the same time, which is always nice. And then you also have these psi skills. These require a different set of points that you mostly get through completing side quests and interacting with other NPCs. And these are also pretty cool, but these are more locked behind the karma system. The game has a light and dark system, very similar to something like Infamous would use, actually, that because it actually locks certain powers behind certain levels of the light or dark karma, effectively. So for the light path, you can get stuff like the ability to levitate, which is actually quite useful for going around certain areas, and the ability to use what's effectively chain lightning in Emperor Palpatine people. And if you're on the dark path, you can get the ability to use telekinesis and fling other people around the arena, which is very fun, and the ability to call down a huge sort of AoE dark lightning strike that can be quite potent if used on large groups. As far as weapons go, there's quite a bit of variety in here too. You have unarmed combat, which has its own set of animations and combos. You have one-handed and two-handed slash, as well as bludgeoning weapons. You've also got the different tribe weapons, which I'll get into in just a minute, and several of those are melee as well. You've also got range weapons, so you can use like rifles, automatic rifles, shotguns, pistols, which are just marked as guns, and some other things like that. And there's also a pretty in-depth crafting system, which is pretty cool. You can add various different bits and bobs to your armor to increase its statistics, and it actually increases its statistics a lot, by the way, so it's very much worth doing this whenever you can. Different armor pieces can have a different number of slots that you can attach things to. You can also build entire weapons from scratch. You can get various components and actually build melee and ranged weapons from these parts, and the eventual stats and elemental powers and things of the weapons when they're finished are determined by the bits and bobs that you actually use to put them together. I really like this system because it's not very restrictive. You can easily disassemble something and put it back together in a different way if you want to, or just replace a couple of parts, so that means you'll be getting a pretty steady stream of components and bits to actually use to improve your weapons and always feel like you're kind of on the curve, as it were, that, you know, for your level you're doing a good amount of damage, and you don't necessarily have to constantly replace weapons as much as just enhance the ones that you already have if you really like them, which is something that I always encourage in RPG, is the ability to sort of attach yourself to a specific weapon if you want to and not just throw it away immediately is nice. And there are even weapon and armor upgrade benches that you can find throughout the world on these hot air balloons, oddly enough, that allow you to upgrade the material and the rarity of the stuff that you're using so that you can just enhance its capabilities even further and not have to replace it if you don't want to. The world itself is actually a pretty interesting one. It is definitely post-apocalyptic, although there are a good variety of areas to travel. It's not just a wasteland. There are beautiful sort of forested fields. There are like heavy jungles that get dark. There are sort of desert and like Colorado red rocky areas. And there's also some hazard zones that you can come across. There's radioactive hazards, hypoxic hazards, areas with no oxygen, thermal hazards, both in terms of hot and cold, and some other stuff. So these are areas that you have to sort of wait to explore because these hazards are very damaging to you if you're not careful. If you don't have a good amount of resistance to that particular element, then you want to sort of wait on these, but you can eventually find suits that will make you immune to that particular damage type that allow you to explore these areas further on. So that sort of gives you a bit of a different set of goals to work towards in terms of the exploration. The dialogue is something that you have to mention is pretty interesting because there actually isn't any technically. There is not exactly what you could call voice acting for the characters in this game. They sort of speak gibberish, and in fact the game itself actually calls it gibberish in the options menu, which is sort of funny. But there is a narrator. There is basically only one voice actor in this game, you could say, because the narrator talks for everyone. He speaks all the time for you, just to narrate the things that you're doing in combat or while exploring, and he also narrates for the characters and tells you what they're saying. So this is a very interesting and odd way of depicting dialogue, basically making sure that no one has their own specific voice and instead the narrator speaks for them. Now the narrator is actually a really good narrator. He's probably been in other games that you've played before. His name is David Shaw Parker, and he has a fantastic voice. A little bit reminiscent of the Stanley Parables narrator, although less sarcastic and a bit of a different voice, but it's that same kind of vibe if you're familiar with that. He's actually been in some other stuff like Vermintide, and he was actually in Mutant Year Zero, which is kind of funny considering the plots of the two games are very similar. But yeah, he's also done other stuff. He's actually famous for being in the Muppets, so that's something as well. But he's got a wonderful voice, and he makes for a very good narrator that is nice to have along the journey. Although what I do like is if you do find his narration grating for any reason, you can reduce the frequency of it. In fact, the game is really good at allowing you to turn on and off various things, which is always a plus for me. Even though I tend to keep a lot of these things on because I like stuff like damage numbers and all that stuff, I also know that when it comes to action RPGs, the screen can get a lot of clutter for a lot of people, and they like to turn things off. So if you don't like those big comic book effects and words appearing and damage numbers and all that stuff, you can individually turn all those things off, including the narrator and even the other animals' gibberish if you don't like them. So always having those options is a good thing. Basically, to sort of sum it all up, what this game actually reminds me of is of old school superhero sandbox games like Infamous, Prototype, Hulk Ultimate Destruction, that sort of era. And in fact, the game specifically reminds me a lot of Cameo Elements of Power, which is a game that not very many people have played. Unfortunately, I thought it was actually pretty good despite its problems and the fact that its open world was very empty, but it's a good game. And yeah, this game is actually kind of is doing something that Doom 2016 did, which I know is a strange comparison, but just bear with me for a second, because what Doom 2016 did was take really old school stuff like Doom and also newer school stuff that was inspired by that old school stuff like Serious Sam and Painkiller and meld them together into a sort of hybrid new old school shooter, and that's what Doom 2016 is, and it ended up very, very good as a result. And in my opinion, this game is doing a similar thing, but with the open world genres. It's melding the newer open world genres of stuff like Ubisoft games like Assassin's Creed and your Arkham Asylum-y stuff, and the older school stuff that inspired that new school stuff, like the superhero sandboxes of Infamous and Prototype and the like, and melding those together into a sort of hybrid new old school open world action RPG. That's what Biomutant is in its entirety, in my opinion. It's basically like a hybrid open world action RPG that calls back to a lot of the older like PlayStation 2 and a little bit early Xbox 360 era of doing open worlds, and also using some of the newer, more Ubisoft-y open world tropes and sort of just meshing them. The game's also got like a teeny bit of like Ratchet and Clank and Jak and Daxter and stuff like that as well. So we're talking about like definitely an older PS2 era feeling game, but with some newer school aspects. And I think that for some people that's going to feel outdated, and maybe those people just don't want to go back to that era, so they're not going to enjoy this as much. But for people like me that really liked those games and kind of want to see a return, because I'm a bit tired of like the Ubisoft open world and I don't mind going back to the things that helped inspire it in the first place, I actually kind of like the overall feel of this game because it reminds me of an older game, and I actually think that's a good thing. For the most part, the game does have its problems, so let's get on to the combat. The combat is not great in this game, unfortunately. It lacks impact, it feels a little bit too weightless, which is unfortunate because the actual animations, the animation quality is really nice, and especially with the tri-weapons, the animations are very good looking, they're satisfying, but the actual impact of the weapons and the combat itself is just not that satisfying. The sound assets for the combat are too quiet and not very good, and the combat just feels very floaty in general. It doesn't help that enemies are all very, very spongy. Even the most basic enemies will constantly be scaling up to your level and will often be above your level, and they have a lot of health, so it never really feels like you have big, impactful hits on enemies because they just take so much damage to go down. This doesn't make the game hard, it just makes it a little bit tedious in terms of combat because things just take forever to die, and the combat feels very light and lacking in impact in general the whole time, so this whole spongy aspect doesn't help that. There are quite a variety of special moves and things, and in fact you can actually use special moves in a chain to charge up what's sort of like a Devil Trigger Rage of the Gods sort of mode that only lasts for about 10 seconds or so, but allows you to dish out a lot of damage for a very brief period of time, although still what the game considers a lot of damage isn't all that much compared to what you're actually going to be going up against, so you still might have to use like the full super combo against a basic enemy like 2 times to actually kill them, because things just take forever to die sometimes. I did mention tribes, and this is a very interesting aspect of the game. There are various tribes that represent each of these 6 sort of karmatic alignments, like pure, dark, and light, somewhat dark and light, and just basic medium dark and light, basically, so there are 3 on each side. And you can align yourself with any one of them that you want, which is really cool, and once you do align yourself with one of them, you can conquer the other tribe's settlements, and eventually make your way to the throne room where the enemy tribe's leader is and defeat them in combat, or persuade them to give up and surrender, whichever one you choose for your character's alignment. And once you do that, you can actually get the tribe weapon. That's how you get them. Tribe weapons are very cool because they have their own complete set of combos and special moves that is unique to any other weapon. They're also quite powerful but can't be crafted or upgraded, so they're very much worth having since they are pretty much the most fun part of the combat in my opinion, since they have some really neat moves and really cool animations to them. And one really unique part of this whole tribe thing that is also one of my biggest problems with it is once you get about halfway through conquering the tribes, the other tribes can just surrender. You can accept their surrender and you no longer have to conquer the rest of them. That will end the tribe warfare questline and they will all be aligned with you at that point, which I think is really cool because if you've ever played something like Far Cry and you've done a lot of outpost liberation gameplay, you know exactly what I mean when I say eventually, even though it might start out fun, it does get a little bit tedious, and once you see just how many of them there are on the map, you don't necessarily want to be bothered with taking every last one of them. So if in something like Far Cry, once you got about half of them, the game said, okay, would you like the other ones to just surrender to your might? And you can say, no, I actually like doing this, or yes, I think I'm done. I think that would be a really cool addition. So I like the fact that that is in this game. You can actually just say, you know what, I think I'm done. I don't really feel the need to conquer all of the other tribes. I think I've had my fill of the tribe gameplay. Or you can say, no, actually, I'm enjoying this a lot, and I don't want them to surrender because I want to actually individually conquer them all. I like that that's a choice. However, the way that it's implemented is very strange, because if you do choose to accept their surrender, you miss out on all of the other tribe weapons that you had not been able to get so far. Whichever ones are still left, you can't have them. You get totally locked out, which is really unfortunate. It actually kind of sucks a lot because they're so fun to use. And you can actually just walk up to them in the individual tribes' throne rooms and see them right there, but you can't get them. So that's kind of unfortunate, and in fact the game does suffer from that problem a lot in my opinion. Things that feel kind of unfinished, or just things that feel like there was originally going to be more to them, but they didn't have time to implement all of it. But the main thing here, the main most egregious unfinished feeling aspect of the game is with Lupa Lupin. So Lupa is sort of your main character's big antagonist. He's not the antagonist of the main story, that would be the four puffs chewing on the tree, but your character has a separate character arc, a separate backstory, and this particular individual, Lupa, is a main part of it. He's the one that burned down your village and made you the way that you are. He's the one that killed your mother, and is part of the reason the tribes are so divided in the modern world of the game. He is the main antagonist for your character. And for the entire game, up until you meet him, it's setting it up as this big karmic decision. Every time you meet one of the main characters that sends you off to fight one of the puffs, they mention, hey, about that Lupa guy, do you want to kill him or do you want to spare him? And you can talk to them about that and actually get various karma points depending on what you choose. So the game is setting this up as this big character-defining choice that you're going to have to make when the time comes. However, spoilers, when the time does come and you actually meet him, you get no choice whatsoever. All of that was totally meaningless. It doesn't matter what you said, you have to kill him. In fact, not only do you not get a choice as to spare him or to kill him, you don't even get a single line of dialogue to speak to him before he fights you. You just meet him, he yells at you, forces you into a fight, you kill him, that's it. And weirdly enough, even if you go back to the characters and that you said that you wanted to kill him to, and they were like, that's kind of dark, maybe you shouldn't do that, now they'll just be like, oh, good job for dealing with him, and just move on. It's very strange. The whole thing just strikes me as a very much like an unfinished plot line that was going to have a lot more of an involved development that went into it, and just didn't quite get there. But aside from some of those more major gripes that I have about some aspects of it feeling kind of unfinished or rough around the edges, I do think it actually ends up being quite a good game. I did mention that these problems prevent it, in my opinion, from being great, but it is still good and worth playing. The combat is serviceable at best. The exploration is fun because the world is actually quite colorful, has a lot of different types of biomes and things to explore, and there's a lot of gear to find, so if you're into the sort of finding loot gameplay loop, this game does it quite well, and the weapon crafting makes it fun to find new components. The character powers and karma abilities and things are fun to use, even if they, again, just like the weapons, don't feel powerful enough to justify using them sometimes. The investment doesn't quite feel worth it because everything just feels too weak compared to the enemy's health gauges being very large. But the story is fun. It is a fun world to explore. The narrator has got a very nice voice, and overall, I think it's actually worth playing, but I do feel that it is too expensive. I think $60 is just a totally outdated prospect. They should not have charged that for this game. I think maybe $40 or $45 is like the perfect price for this game, and I would urge you to actually play it if you can find it for around that price on something like, say, Green Man Gaming, not sponsored. I just know that they tend to offer it for around that price. I think if you like the old school superhero sandboxes, then you will enjoy this game. I like the fact that it's calling back to something that I haven't really expected any modern game to be calling back to, and I would like to see this team make another game after this with what they've learned from it, with a little bit more time involved and able to actually truly make something great. Because I think this game has the hallmark of a game made by people that just like video games and wanted to put some of their favorite video games into their own to make it fun. This does not feel like a focus group, kind of Ubisoft-y, make it as appealing to as wide but shallow an audience as possible kind of corporate affair. This feels like a game made by people that like games, and I want to see them do more of it because I think that they can actually do a really good job. So that is Biomutant, rough around the edges and very flawed, but calling back to an era that I want to see more callbacks to now that I've experienced it. Thank you guys very much for watching. The link will be in the description below this video to the Steam store page if you want to go and check it out, and I'll see you guys next time.